The World with Richard Engel and Yalda Hakim is a brand new podcast from Sky News. With me, Sky News' lead world news presenter, Yalda Hakim.
And me, Richard Engel, chief foreign correspondent for NBC News.
Every week, we'll be reporting from the front line of the world's trouble spots and asking the big questions to the world's most important and influential people.
Join us for the ground truth to help you understand what is happening in the world today and why it matters to you.
So that's The World with Richard Engel and Yalda Hakim.
Listen every Wednesday, wherever you get your podcasts.
Hi everyone, welcome back to the Sky News Daily. Niall Paterson here, and I'm going to start this episode with an apology, though I hasten to add, not from me. Instead, it's going to be coming from the head of the Association of Ambulance Chief Executives. You'll have seen before, Sky News' Rachael Venables has been looking into allegations of sexual misconduct among paramedics for the best part of a year now, and she joins us again on the podcast. Good to see you, Rachael. Look, the apology, who from and why?
So the apologies come from Jason Killens, who is the Chief Executive of the Welsh Ambulance Service, but also more than that, and this was the capacity in which he was speaking to us, he chairs the Association of Ambulance Chief Executives. And after a year now of our investigation into sexual harassment and abuse and really deep-seated misogyny in the ambulance service across the UK, we were able to get a sit-down interview with him to put some of the allegations, to put the wider concerns to him. And effectively, he said sorry.
It's just not right. We shouldn't have anyone having to leave their workplace because they don't feel safe or because they've been subject to inappropriate behaviour in the workplace. We've failed those individuals. I'm determined, as the chair of ACE, to continue the work that's already been started to make all of our workplaces safe for all of our people. We have seen more cases, historical cases, come forward. I expect we'll see a steady increase over the next year or so as a result of the work we're doing. But it's also important that we play the long game here and we begin to tackle low-level misconduct or inappropriate behaviour early rather than let it fester and get worse.
We will be looking in some depth at some of the allegations made at multiple ambulance services, I should note. But did Mr Killens provide any rationale, any reason, any justification for the fact that up until this point, this issue seems to have flown beneath the radar?
His own organisation, actually, the Association of Ambulance Chief Executives, published a report last winter which highlighted real concerns for the sexual safety of staff in the sector. They actually found, and I'm just quoting here, that harassment is deemed acceptable or a rite of passage in NHS trusts, which they said normalises or creates a toxic culture with risks to mental and physical health and potentially patient safety. So when we started to look into this story, we realised that there was a huge amount of work, body of work, into individual trusts or from individual organisations, but nobody had ever, I think, really properly put it together and explained the scale and the extent of this to the public.
Because there is almost an assumption, isn't there, that when it comes to people working in care, in hospitals, in medical situations, as paramedics do day in, day out, we assume that these people are always here to help, and that just isn't the case. Tell me about Lucy.
So Lucy is a woman who I met earlier this year, and she had a really harrowing story about what happened to her a number of years ago now after she'd been on a night out. Now, she was at the time a single mum, and she described how she really enjoyed the rare times that her children were looked after so she could go out to the pub with some friends. And on this particular night, she says that she was spiked. Her drink was spiked, and she really doesn't remember what happened post that point. But an ambulance was called. A man and a woman arrived in a double-crewed ambulance to take her to hospital. And as she tells it, as the female paramedic was driving her to the hospital, she looked in the sort of rear-view mirror that would allow her to see back into the cab. And she claimed, this female paramedic, that she saw her male colleague sexually assaulting Lucy. And Lucy had to be told what had happened to her when she woke up. Now, the paramedic himself denied having done anything. He said that he didn't do it, and he was actually found not guilty at trial. But the paramedics regulator, the HCPC, have a lower standard of proof, effectively, and they struck him off and found against him.
Just explain why, if there is a not guilty verdict at a criminal court, that the HCPC, the Health and Care Professions Council, the governing body for this profession, can take a step as extreme as striking off? Because I think people will be confused by that.
Very much so. So there is a different burden of proof in a criminal court as there is in a civil court. In a criminal court, the jury have to be convinced beyond all reasonable doubt that the individual is guilty, whereas at a civil level, it's based on the balance of probabilities. So it's a slightly lower bar to clear. And that effectively is the bar that the Healthcare Professions Council operates at. So they considered the evidence from both sides and they decided that this individual was, I think in their phrasing, a risk to patient safety, and he was struck off.
What was the effect on Lucy, a woman, let's not forget, who had her drink spiked in the first place?
I think for years she hasn't discussed this with anybody. She said that she still wouldn't feel safe getting in an ambulance today. If she needed to call 999 for a loved one or for herself, I think she would very seriously consider getting herself to hospital because she's just so scared, even several years on.
When I read of the culture of misogyny, the culture of sexism, the banter, and I'm using huge inverted commas here, that takes place amongst paramedics, that to me is the thing I just can't quite get my head around. Tell me more.
In many ways, that's where this investigation started at the beginning of the year, because it was very clear to me that there had been for decades a real culture of banter, inappropriate comments, jokes, touching from male paramedics to their female co-workers, or certainly from male ambulance workers. The one woman I remember who said to me, and her story has always stuck with me, I just look forward to the winter where I can wear my coat and cover up because I won't get comments about my body. She's talked about receiving really horrendous jokes in front of patients while she was, in one example, kneeling on the floor next to a patient. So you can imagine the sort of jokes that was put to her then by a colleague. And it's this level which I think has always existed in the ambulance service. We know that they have a dark sense of humour, a gallows humour, it might be described as. And I think to an extent they need that to deal with what is a very difficult job. But I think it's very clear that this has surpassed what is acceptable. Women feel as though they are the butt of these awful comments and jokes and approaches about sex, you know, being asked if they ask for something, for example, from a male colleague, they might get told, well, I'll do it if you sleep with me, or why don't you send a photo of yourself, you know, and these can be seen as jokes by the men, but obviously by the women, it's something that's much more serious. And I think it's something that's proven quite insidious. Jason Killen's, in my interview with him, you know, he sort of said we have to tackle this low-level banter because that's what allows then other worse behaviour to fester and to flourish.
Whilst I can completely understand finding the humour in the darkness, if you are working as a paramedic, there is a country mile between that and, well, explain the acronym TUBES.
And this is something that a former female paramedic who left the ambulance service largely because of this culture told me was a well-understood acronym. TUBE stands for Totally Unnecessary Breast Examination. Now, she says she first heard this when she was a student and a male trainee paramedic groped one of the women there and said, I've just done a tube on you. She said that that was common parlance and it was understood that that's what a tube meant. Now, it doesn't mean that these men were groping the female patients. She never saw it herself, but she did at times hear them say that they'd picked up perhaps a drunk, vulnerable woman and would say, oh yeah, I tubed her. And I think for her, just if you're able to joke about something like that, that is something which is very, very terrifying, given the power that these individuals have over us when we're in really our most vulnerable states.
If there is a culture amongst paramedics that permits, condones, or overlooks, let's be charitable, you know, joking about sexual assault, let's call it what it is, you've got to imagine that the culture internally amongst paramedics, and you've alluded to this already, isn't great either. I mean, this is the point at which I think you should tell us about Ellie.
Ellie is a former ambulance worker. She actually worked in a control room. And she said it was her first job, pretty much. She was very young, in her early 20s. She really enjoyed it, taking 999 calls, dispatching ambulances and giving life-saving advice on the phone to people in, at times, their darkest moments. But she said after a few months in the job, a manager called her into his office and effectively propositioned her. He said in as many words that if she were to sleep with him, it would be good for her career, and he groped her. And she claims that what followed was a bombardment of messages and sleazy, awful comments in the workplace. She said she didn't sleep before going into the office. He would send her photos of his private parts. He would say to her things that he wanted to do to her sexually. And she said over and over again, she either ignored it or she said, no, leave me alone. But that he didn't stop. And eventually she says she took it to more senior people within her organisation. And even though she was able to show them these messages, she claims that they suggested moving her to a different office instead. And she says eventually she quit, she couldn't handle it anymore. And her allegation is that this individual is still working at that ambulance service today. And for her, she really felt as though he was the one who was protected and she was the problem.
The World with Richard Engel and Yalda Hakim is a brand new podcast from Sky News. With me, Sky News' lead world news presenter, Yalda Hakim.
And me, Richard Engel, chief foreign correspondent for NBC News.
Every week, we'll be reporting from the front line of the world's trouble spots and asking the big questions to the world's most important and influential people.
Join us for the ground truth to help you understand what is happening in the world today and why it matters to you.
So that's The World with Richard Engel and Yalda Hakim.
Listen every Wednesday, wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome back. We're continuing to talk about allegations of sexual misconduct by paramedics, on patients, with our correspondent Rachael Venables, who's been looking into this story for the past year. And Rachel, just before the break, you were telling us Ellie's story, Ellie working as a call handler in the ambulance control room. It strikes me that she raised her concerns with her bosses, that she had evidence to show that there was misconduct taking place, and yet her bosses, for whatever reason, didn't seem to follow through on this. Is there just a complete absence of a complaints process?
It's important to stress that what happened to her was a few years ago now, but we've spoken to plenty of people who still believe as though if they raise a concern, it won't be dealt with properly. There are all sorts of procedures in place, and actually there is a specific body, the paramedics regulator, the Health and Care Professions Council, the HCPC, who exist to investigate these sorts of allegations. They register or regulate only paramedics, so people who work elsewhere in the ambulance service who maybe also have been affected, poisoned even by this culture. They don't regulate them, but they certainly can get involved when it comes to serious complaints about paramedics.
And when you look at the HCPC process, I mean, some of the statistics are really scary. Paramedics are in fact overrepresented when it comes to allegations of sexual misconduct in HCPC investigations.
Yes, so the HCPC regulate 15 different bodies, different healthcare professions, and paramedics make up 11% off that overall total. So you would expect the number of say, sexual misconduct allegations to be around 11%. But actually, paramedics' allegations of sexual misconduct against colleagues represent 64% of the total number of investigations that the HCPC received in the last year, so 2023 to 2024. I should also stress that the body themselves and their chair, Christine Elliott, who we spoke to for this piece, was adamant really that the number of allegations that they receive are just the tip of the iceberg. I mean, in total, it's less than 1% of the overall body of people that they regulate across the board receive any form of concern about them. So it's a small number, but I think it's clear that she felt as though the real number was much higher. And certainly we have spoken to many, many people over the past year whose claims never made it to the HCPC. I'm going to go out on a limb here, Rachel, and suggest that even when this process works, it works very slowly. Am I right? It does, yeah, very, very slowly. I think the latest data is bouncing around 160 weeks, sometimes slightly under, sometimes slightly over, to go from the moment of a complaint being received by the HCPC and a final fitness to practice decision being made. And that's something which, when I asked Christine Elliott about, she admitted was absolutely not good enough. They can put in a number of interim orders, for example, to prevent someone from practicing. They could place conditions on somebody's ability to work while they investigate the case. But that is a victim who is in limbo for a long time.
Why is it taking so long? I just don't get it.
They say more concerns are coming to them every time. Last year, I think they said there was more than 2,200 total concerns raised, which was an increase of 26% on the previous year. So they're getting more in already, but obviously the problem pre-existed that. They also say they face sometimes external pressures. They claim it's things like delays from NHS trusts. So maybe they say to the ambulance service, provide us the information, provide us the evidence, and they're having to wait a long time. Sometimes Christine Elliott claimed they butt alongside the criminal justice system and they might have to maybe wait for an investigation to complete there and go to court. And we know, of course, how long it's taking the justice system to operate. But also they are calling for really a change in the law around the way that they operate.
Christine Elliott, chair of the regulatory body for paramedics. Jason Killens, chair of the Association of Ambulance Chief Executives. To what do they attribute this? What on earth is going on amongst paramedics that this sort of behaviour is overlooked, tolerated, ignored?
Christine Elliott, when I asked her, said it really has to come down to the culture and the leadership. And she said that if the culture permits sexual misconduct in any form, it will just flourish. Jason Killens was less keen, I think, to get into the question of why this is a problem, but I think both acknowledge that there have been historic failings. I would suggest from my own experience that this is about an organisation which historically was very male-dominated, with a stress of rank and authority and a lot of lone working that would allow a perpetrator to operate freely. I think with the paramedics, you have perhaps a perfect storm of a very stressful job, in which case a person might be working with somebody much more senior to them alone in the back of an ambulance, and really would worry that with this sort of us and them mentality that comes into such an intense organisation in which loyalty is a priority, that if they were to accuse somebody of saying something inappropriate or of touching them inappropriately, that maybe they wouldn't be believed, that they themselves would be ostracised. And that fear has really permeated through the years.
I have lost count, Rachel, of the number of institutions over the years that have said, do you know what, it's cultural. It's a cultural problem and we're going to sort it out. This is 2024, not 1994. And I'm sorry, I'm getting quite upset about this. For the chair of the Association of Ambulance Chief Executives to blame the culture of the organisation that he sits atop, I don't think that's enough.
He's talked about there really being two solutions to this, one of which is rooting out the abusers and the other is changing the culture at a lower level. One story that I'd really like to tell you about is a woman described how, I think it was last year, Sexual Safety Charter was introduced. This was around the time, I think, that the NHS was really starting to understand about the scale of the problem. And so in the women's loos in where she worked, posters were put up which said, "We don't tolerate sexual harassment." And for her telling, a man went into the toilets, crossed out the "not," so it now read, "We do tolerate sexual harassment," and there was a sketch drawn of a male body part and I think a female mouth. So you can imagine how that makes the women who have to see that feel that they don't believe the culture really can change as much as these procedures will be put in place. Again, we have to stress this is a minority, but clearly there is more than the minority who have let this happen and who have let comments and behaviours go or protected individuals or not believed the victims.
You've been covering this, as you say, for the best part of a year. Do you think this is a system that can be changed, a service that can be changed in the way in which Jason Killens is talking about?
I think change is happening. I think when I speak to people who were in the service 20 years ago versus today, it was certainly much more prevalent then. And I think that what you're seeing within the ambulance service more generally is actually a real culture change as well, with more young women joining than men. And so that will slowly, piece by piece, affect change. And I think really crucially, people have to feel more comfortable in speaking out and to believe that if they do make an allegation, they'll be believed. It's really interesting. Since we've put out our stories, we've been forwarded letters and emails that individual ambulance trusts have sent to their colleagues after Sky News has done our various investigations this year, insisting that change is coming, that people can speak up. And some people I've spoken to say that they do feel as though it's a little lighter. But clearly this problem is so endemic, it is something that isn't going to be fixed overnight. There's no way.
And that's a lot for this edition of The Daily. If you want to read more of Rachel's reporting, indeed watch her full report, just head to skynews.com. We'll see you the same time tomorrow.
The World with Richard Engel and Yalda Hakim is a brand new podcast from Sky News. With me, Sky News' lead world news presenter, Yalda Hakim.
And me, Richard Engel, chief foreign correspondent for NBC News.
Every week, we'll be reporting from the front line of the world's trouble spots and asking the big questions to the world's most important and influential people.
Join us for the ground truth to help you understand what is happening in the world today and why it matters to you.
So that's The World with Richard Engel and Yalda Hakim.
Listen every Wednesday, wherever you get your podcasts.